Hi, AP World students. Mrs. Longnecker here again. And for this video, we are going to look at a subtopic from the bigger topics of Unit 8, particularly around the ideas of independence and decolonization. Specifically today, we're going to talk about the apartheid system in South Africa, how it was created, how it functioned, and how it was eventually dismantled near the end of the 20th century. You'll find that this system is different from the independence narratives of a lot of countries in Africa that you've already looked at and read about, but it is significant in looking at the idea of decolonization or of dismantling the structures of imperialism and European dominance in African countries, even that begins and continues even after independence has been achieved. So let's talk about some specifics around apartheid. Before we dive in, I want to acknowledge that a lot of the research and work that I'm going to present to you, as well as all of the slides that I'm going to show you, were created by my friend and fellow teacher, Eric Beckman, who works in Anoka, Minnesota. He's an awesome resource for learning about world history, and I'm really grateful that he was generous enough to share his work with me so that I could make this video for you. So, before we get into talking about apartheid, we need to talk about South African history. And a little bit of background about South African history. South Africa is an incredibly diverse country. It always has been. When we think about apartheid, it's very easy to just talk in terms of blacks and whites, as these were the terms used in South Africa to refer to different groups of people. But there's actually a lot of diversity in South Africa, even before the arrival of Europeans or people from other parts of the world. There are incredibly diverse African indigenous ethnic communities, including groups like the Zulu, who are a Bantu people, primarily a pastoral society with wealth focused in cattle, notable as warriors, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Xhosa people are another Bantu group in South Africa, also pastoralists, with, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, a long history of conflict with the Zulu. Other Africans in South Africa were agriculturalists, some were pastoralists, and there are some groups in South Africa who were hunting and gathering peoples, even into the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. The Portuguese in the 14th and 15th centuries were the first to establish European trading posts in South Africa, but the Dutch were the first Europeans to settle in South Africa in large numbers. And the descendants of these Dutch settlers called themselves Afrikaners, which is Dutch for Africans. They identified themselves with the place where they had settled. So if you think a corollary to this would be people of European descent who came to the United States or to North America, founded the United States, and then thought of themselves as Americans. They set aside that previous identity with a European homeland and saw themselves as native to the place where they lived. These Afrikaners created a distinct culture of their own in South Africa, separate from the Netherlands and separate from the indigenous African communities in South Africa as well. In the 19th century, the British claimed South Africa after the defeat of Napoleon. Conflict in Europe led to Europeans claiming one another's imperial territories, including in places like Africa. And the arrival of the British brought both European British settlers into South Africa, as well as large numbers of South Asian migrants as well. So as imperialism is changing the landscape in South Africa, it is bringing increased diversity of people from all around the world as people from throughout the British Empire moved to different parts of that empire. Diversity in world history, we've seen, sometimes inspires innovation, sometimes inspires the spread of culture, but it also sometimes leads to conflict. And there are some notable conflicts in South African history that we want to be aware of. From the 1770s to the 1870s, the Zulu in South Africa expanded their territory significantly, moving from the southern coastlands of South Africa into the interior. They conquered other groups, and groups that weren't conquered by the Zulu were sometimes pushed further inland. So there was this increasing pressure of conflict as groups moved inland to escape from the Zulu Mfokane in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the late 19th century, as the British sought to more firmly establish their control in South Africa, that brought the British then into conflict with the Zulu. And the Zulu versus British wars in the late 19th century, the Zulu were successful in some notable and significant battles. Their technology wasn't as industrialized as the British, but their skill as warriors and the military tactics of their leaders were still very effective in their home territory and on their home turf. Ultimately, the industrial technology of the British military did give British military victory in the region and consolidated then British control of Southern Africa. This British control was not only a threat to the Zulu, it was also a threat to the Afrikaners. Remember, these are people of European descent who had formed an identity and saw themselves as Africans. And these Afrikaners pushed inland to get away from British control. This is a migration known to Afrikaners as the Great Trek. And for a time, that allowed the two groups to coexist somewhat peacefully. Eventually, however, the discovery of gold and diamonds in Afrikaner-controlled regions sent the British military to take control of those territories as well. The Boer Wars of the late 19th and early 20th centuries between primarily Afrikaner and British troops from 1880 to 1881, and then again from 1899 to 1902. These were particularly violent and problematic conflict. During these conflicts, the British imprisoned both Black Africans and Afrikaners, including women and children, in concentration camps. So this was not simply a military conflict. This was a targeting of entire populations of people for removal from particular territory, and resulted in tens of thousands of civilian deaths. So conflict in South Africa did not start with apartheid, did not start as being necessarily based in skin color, but the conflicts of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries were very violent. They did target groups based on race and ethnicity, and they did broadly target civilians as well as military forces. South Africa was a settler colony. Settler colonies, if you remember from our study of 19th century imperialism, is where large numbers of people from the occupying country come to live in that territory, often pushing indigenous populations off of their traditional homelands and or increasing violence toward those groups. And some of the results of settler colonialism in South Africa specifically were racialized enslavement of people. Afrikaners used enslaved labor of Black Africans on their farms. The British outlawed slavery technically throughout their empire by 1833, but coerced and exploitive labor practices continued in South Africa. Black Africans were coerced into wage labor, so they were forced to work for very low wages in order to pay off debts or because of racial prejudice. South Asians, Indians, were often brought into South Africa as indentured servants. So they worked, sometimes without pay, for a period of years in order to pay off the debt of bringing them to South Africa, at which point they were theoretically able to leave and go pursue employment or wealth in other fields, but oftentimes remained as servants in the households of wealthy British, because the opportunities for jobs or for gaining wealth weren't necessarily as widely available to them. Most of the work done in these exploitive and coerced forms was either mineral extraction, so gold and diamond mining, particularly in the interior of South Africa, as well as agriculture along the coastlands, vineyards and wine making, as well as growing crops and food for sale throughout the region. South Africa's political independence from the British Empire actually happened significantly earlier than most African colonies. The Union of South Africa declared its independence from the British Empire in 1910. And this Union of South Africa created a new government at the time then, founded on the idea of white supremacy. This is an interesting phrase for us to hear as Americans, especially in the 20th century, where our cultural conversation is a lot about white supremacy. But the idea of race-based differences in intellect, in skills and capabilities were enshrined into the law from the very beginning of the Union of South Africa. Segregation was legal and was written into the law code of the Union. And the Native Land Act of 1913 set aside specific lands for Black Africans, thereby releasing the remainder of the land in South Africa for use by Afrikaners. However, the lands reserved for Black Africans were only 7% of the entire land in the country. And of course, Black Africans made up considerably more than 7% of the population. Additionally, many of the specific lands set aside and known as Bantustans were not desirable lands, not the traditional homelands of the people who were being forced to live in these places. And they were very difficult for the types of agriculture that these communities had traditionally practiced. And then the remaining 93% of the land was then allocated to Afrikaners, to white South Africans, for use in the various industries and ways that they then saw fit. And this imbalance, this inequality sparked early protests from African activists, including the African National Congress, which we will see was a major nationalist activist group involved in protesting policies of segregation and of apartheid. Now, apartheid itself comes into play in 1948. And apartheid is an Afrikaans word for apartness or separation. And it is legally enshrined white supremacy that puts the Afrikaners, who were a minority population in South Africa, into all of the positions of prominence in government, economy, and society. The National Party was the party of the Afrikaners. They then took control fully of the government in 1948, really taking control away from not Black Africans, who had very little political power even prior to this, but away from British interests, which might have been seen as being somewhat more equitable, even though they were also legally in favor of segregation. Apartheid and the National Party strengthened segregation throughout South Africa, creating a specific racial hierarchy in South Africa, with whites at the top and Black Africans at the bottom. But there were groups in between. Asians occupied a particular category within the racial hierarchy of apartheid, as well as a group known as coloreds. And depending on which scholars you read, this colored group doesn't mean necessarily Black South Africans, the way that we used the word in US history, nor does it mean people of mixed race, because it was actually illegal for people of different races to marry or have children. And so this group of coloreds kind of shifted depending on the year and the time. It may have simply been people with lighter skin. It may have been people of mixed race ancestry. It may sometimes have been people of South Asian or of Indigenous African history. It's a really kind of messy and complicated term. The big idea of this racial hierarchy, though, is that it enforced inequality. Non-whites were required to carry paperwork identifying them by name, by racial categorization, and by homeland, so that if they were seen in a part of the country where whites believed they should not be, they could be identified and either sent back or arrested for being where they shouldn't be. So these passbooks were a source of real frustration for activists as well. White supremacy reigned in jobs, in housing, in education, in government, right? Apartheid enshrined white supremacy and codified or made very clear in the law a racial hierarchy in South Africa. So even though South Africa in 1948 was independent from a larger empire, it still had not decolonized itself as a country, because the legacies of imperialism and of white supremacy were still fully baked into the way the country operated. And I'm going to put a graph up on the screen right now for you to take a look at, and you can see, you can even pause right now and take a look at the inequality between blacks and whites in South Africa. If you look at the population numbers, you can see how much of a minority the white population were, but then look at every other category, right? The whites owned 87% of the land. They made 75% of the national income. Their minimal taxable income was higher than that of blacks, so they could make more money before even paying taxes on it. They had more doctors, they had a lower infant mortality rate, they had greater spending and better class sizes to educate their children, right? Every aspect of society and culture was touched legally by apartheid. And this movement seems like just a juggernaut of racism in South Africa, and it was. And so it's important to pause and remember that apartheid was not inevitable, and it wasn't without resistance. The African National Congress, one of the major political activist groups in South Africa, was formed in 1912. So this is even before the Native Land Act. And it was formed to oppose white supremacy. The ANC represented coloreds and blacks in that racial categorization that we talked about, and drew in many of the famous activists from South African history. In the 1940s, the ANC Youth League Nelson Mandela participated in the ANC Youth League in the 1940s. They took actions of petitions to gain support for their views, defiance campaigns, mass protests, political organization, and even more violent forms of protest, including sabotage and guerrilla warfare. The ANC wasn't the only group representing African interests. The Pan-African Congress, the PAC, split off from the ANC in 1959. They were strongly pro-Africanist, so specifically representing Black populations, instead of the more broad strokes of the ANC, which also represented the interests of that colored population as well. And so, right, multiple groups with slightly differing viewpoints and differing ways of going about their actions, but they were actively and at times aggressively opposing apartheid from the moment it began. Some of these protests were notable, particularly for the violence that arose out of these protests. A couple of famous ones include the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960. This was a protest against the passbook laws, that requirement to carry paperwork by non-white citizens. Police attacked unarmed citizens who were protesting these laws. 69 people were killed, 180 were injured. But this was a defining step in the anti-apartheid movement because it was publicized. It was seen on television. People saw exactly what happened. And overall, the protest and activist movements grew after the massacre, even though the National Party in government banned both the ANC and the PAC. In 1976, a student protest against the requirement that they learn Afrikaans, which many students saw as an attempt to strip them of their traditional cultures. This protest in Soweto, a township just outside Johannesburg, led police again to attack the students. 360 students were killed, and overall the government tightened control even further on protest groups and protest parties. You can see some images of students protesting the law, of police attacking the students, and of some of the aftermath of the violence. But both of these were very well known, well publicized, and they were reported on globally. So as you've been learning about globalization in the 20th century, the process of decolonization and of ending apartheid in South Africa is related to the fact that now in the 20th century, these events are being reported on and talked about, not just in South Africa, but all around the world. Before we talk about the collapse of apartheid, I want to acknowledge some of the specific anti-apartheid leaders who were really significant for their activism in South African politics. One is Stephen Biko, who was a big proponent of the idea of Black consciousness, that Africans should see themselves as an ethnicity, as a race that is full of dignity and value and worth, and that it's not about trying to, just become equal with whites, although he certainly promoted that as well, but about showing that Black Africans were and are fully and importantly, people deserving of respect in their own right, not just for some vague idea of equality. He was placed under house arrest by South African police in 1973 for 2 years, and then later in 1977, Steve Biko unfortunately was beaten to death in police custody for his continued activism and promotion of rights for Black South Africans. Probably more famous to you in your lifetime was Nelson Mandela. He protested apartheid laws as part of the ANC Youth Party, as a lawyer, later as a leader in the ANC party itself. He, though, while in his later life, was known for his nonviolent movements of protest. He was also a member of the Spear of the Nation, which was the military wing of the ANC that promoted some of the more aggressive and even violent tactics of protest. And as a result of this participation, Nelson Mandela was jailed for supposed participation in a sabotage plot. And he remained in jail from 1964 until 1990. And so much of his activist work took place both before and after that long jail sentence. So you're thinking, okay, if Nelson Mandela's in jail and Stephen Biko has been killed by police, how did apartheid collapse? Well, it's important to know there are lots of other activists, lots of other people fighting to end apartheid the entire time. South African resistance included civil disobedience, included violence against pro-apartheid targets, right? Lots of different ways of actively protesting and of Black South Africans saying, this is not right. In addition to those internal resistance, we also began to see in the 1980s international pressure against the government of South Africa. There were boycotts. People boycotted South African products. People boycotted South African governments, right? The South African government and their diplomats, their ambassadors were not welcome in certain countries because of these policies. And probably most notable, but not necessarily the most effective, are the athletic boycotts. FIFA, the World Soccer Organization, the Olympics, and a number of other international athletic communities refused to participate with South Africa in international competition because it was seen as supporting the values of the South African government. Universities and businesses also divested, which is the opposite of investing. So they took their money away from South African businesses, hoping that those businesses would then pressure the government into changing its policies. And the National Party in the late 80s and early 90s saw that apartheid as it existed in their legal code could not continue. And so the process of ending apartheid began in the early 1990s and, in a legal sense, culminated with the official end of apartheid in the 1994 free elections. In 1994, not only were all South Africans, regardless of race, allowed to vote in the presidential election for the first time since 1948, but people of all races were allowed to run in this election in 1994. So you can imagine there were long lines of people waiting to vote, and there was a long ballot with a lot of people running for office with the attempt to be the first leader of the newly free South Africa. The ANC won a majority of seats in the parliament, and Nelson Mandela was elected the first Black president of South Africa in 1994. And so even with the legal dismantling of these racist policies of apartheid, there's still a lot of legacy, right? This idea of decolonization, getting rid of the legacy of imperialism, getting rid of the legacy of white supremacy, was going to take a lot of work. And there was a lot of concern among members of the National Party and Afrikaners in general that the end of apartheid was going to mean violence against them, revenge against them, whether deserved or undeserved. And so South Africa took an interesting step in that they launched what became known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this was an organization led by Bishop Desmond Tutu, who was also an activist against apartheid, but known for being nonviolent, for being peaceful, for being very fair. As a member of the church, he was very widely respected. And the goal of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to restore peace and stability. And it consisted of a series of legal hearings, so like court proceedings, where members of the apartheid government, including law enforcement, politicians, business owners, etc., gave testimony under oath about their crimes and abuses under the apartheid system. So people told their stories. Victims told stories of what had happened to them, but perpetrators told stories of the things they had done under apartheid. Amnesty was given for many of these political crimes. Amnesty meaning that they, in exchange for their honest and truthful testimony, then they would not be punished for these crimes. And the idea was to get information out in the open. One of the really terrifying parts of apartheid was the fact that some activists, their fates were never known. Or some people who weren't prominent activists but were against apartheid, who spoke out, who criticized, who simply were in the wrong place at the wrong time, disappeared, and no one ever knew what happened to them. And this Truth and Reconciliation Commission gave perpetrators the opportunity to tell what they had done, murders they had committed, violence they had enacted, and it gave families the opportunity for closure and to know what had happened to their loved ones. Rather than keeping the secrets in order for people to protect themselves against retaliation, people could tell what had happened and allow for forgiveness and reconciliation to take place. And this was, for the kind of the broad strokes of this commission, was very successful. However, it did not fully resolve the tensions and the anger and the issues that are still a part of decolonizing, of removing the legacies of imperialism from South Africa today. South Africa continues to have high poverty rates for Black South Africans. There continues to be economic superiority for whites. They own the majority of land and businesses throughout the country. And corruption in government has really slowed the process of this decolonization. In the 21st century, there's an increasing distrust for the ANC, and many of the promised reforms and changes that the government ambitiously went into in the mid-1990s still have not fully been realized in South Africa. So I'm hoping that by telling you this story of apartheid, what you can see is that the legacies of imperialism aren't just about imperial control of a place, but about the changes to culture and society and politics that then leave a lasting legacy even beyond independence, even beyond getting rid of laws about racism and white supremacy. This is an ongoing process that South Africa and many other countries around the world continue to face. Students, thanks for sticking with me in a long lesson with a lot of detail. I really appreciate your hard work and your efforts to understand this. As always, if you have any questions about what you've been learning, feel free to contact me and we'll try and get those questions answered for you. Thank you again for being here, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.